We heard the industry, so now we have the chance to discuss how we can make things better. But before I give the start, I like the last thing that Isabelle said, that no one can succeed on his own. And I guess that should be the theme today, because it has to be a coordinated action from all of us. Well, please, any questions to the industry, of course, to the honorable ministers or regulators? Please, sir. Yes. Can I have your name first, your organization, and the question? Thank you.
Thank you, moderator. My name is Tuaha Moti. I'm the chairman of Mozambique Communication Regulatory Authority under the Minister of Transport and Communication. I have two questions, one to John, two to John and one to David. John, we know that GSMA is a global organization unifying the mobile ecosystem. And there is a myth that the mobile operators are not deploying at the pace that we require the 5G because they do not have a clear insight about the use case of 5G, whether it will be profitable if they deploy for a massive tech or only for deployment based on the capacity deployment driven. The second is a request. What can you play as a champion to put together the industry, mainly the main manufacturers like Huawei, Ericsson, and others, so that whenever they want to deliver this tech to developing country, they have to also see that they cannot make the same profit as selling the same infrastructure to develop the country. To David, you mentioned that there's a diesel taxes. My question is, what was the approach? Do they only defer these taxes to the ICT sector, or they bring other sector of economy on board? Because we cannot make digital transformation just leaving to the ICT sector, because digital transformation is cross-cutting issues, and several sectors of economy will benefit if the ICT industry deploy digital infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you. John, sure. You got the most fair share, I guess, from the questions.
So excellent. So thank you so much for your question. I think one of the first observations I would make is that, as we look at 5G, 5G itself, I wouldn't view as a race. I know that in many markets they're trying to, compete with each other to be the first market. But what's more important is laying the framework. So at the time your market is ready for 5G, or the investment case is there, that one, the necessary environment is there, but also hopefully economies of scale have already come into the equipment arena. So I think particularly when we look in Africa, knowing there's still a huge opportunity around 4G, we should also be focusing on what we can do to enable investment there. And I think what you raised is exactly the question where I think industry needs to be sitting down with governments, because there's the same objective. The same objective is to reach more people. But what is holding that back? And I think in every country it might be slightly different. So I do think there's a huge opportunity. I think, as Isabelle mentioned, it is important. Public-private partnership is increasingly, sometimes we use it as in a generic sense. I really think if we don't start doing it now, we cannot achieve the objectives we want to achieve. When you spoke about the issue around the cost of equipment in developing markets, I think it's a challenge in all markets. It is expensive equipment. It's important equipment. We know it's driving the broader economy. One thing we've been focusing on, of course, is the mobile operator community, and I should say it's a relatively controversial point because we have great friends, of course, in our suppliers, Ericsson and Huawei. But we also know there's two big factors here. One, geopolitics is making it increasingly challenging to have both in the same markets. And also, there's been so much consolidation in the equipment markets that effectively we have anywhere from 3 to 4 players, depending on how you define it. So one of the things we've been quite focused on at GSMA is how can we drive a market that starts to be more open and interoperable, what we call Open RAN, so that you're going to create a broader base of equipment supply and hopefully then have more competition and then drive down price. I think that's one of the things we're quite focused on. I will be with some of these fellows next week, fellows and ladies at Ericsson and at Huawei, and I will make your point. But I think what we really need to do is we need to create the environment that drives competition, that brings the prices down for it to be sustainable.
Thank you. Are you satisfied by the... Okay. Please, sir.
Should I answer the...
Sorry. Yes, David.
Yeah, great.
I'm sorry.
Thank you for the question. Well, to my mind, there's 2 elements to your question. And firstly, you're quite correct. This is not about one sector only. I mean, I was discussing a very specific issue to networks and network usage based on information that we have at the moment about volumes. But I think there's 2 points to be made. Firstly, in relation to contributions to networks, we're in that instance, we're not talking about tax, we're talking about contributions. But the Broadband Commission report was very clear that it was all companies that benefited. It wasn't specifically ICT companies. You can imagine other types of online services. Now, obviously, services that are located in a country will pay for connectivity, but you can imagine e-medicine service that could become a global thing, for example, as in a very large global e-medicine platform might emerge that's doing business in every country in the world and not paying for any connectivity. That is a potential future. I think we'll see all sorts of services. We're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. The companies that happen to be dominating traffic at the moment may not be in a few years' time. We might be talking about companies from completely different countries, or maybe not. But I agree that in principle, and I think the various reports have looked at this have been very clear. It is not only about big tech traffic. This is about connecting all services that benefit. But turning to taxes for a second, and it's a different question, but it's an important one, in particular for regions such as the Caribbean and emerging regions. The question of how public services are funded by governments as the economy moves online is critically important. You can imagine a future, and I think if the regulatory framework is not right, we can imagine a framework, a future where the entire economy of every service imaginable is online and provided from overseas, provided from the big jurisdictions. And what are we then in the Caribbean? We're just takers of services. Your lawyers, your accountants, your doctors, every service you can imagine is provided online by AI or whatever from overseas. And there's no taxable base left in the country. There's no way to fund public services. And this is not as distant a reality or a possibility as we might like to think. This could really happen, and it could really happen soon as well. Certainly we're seeing the local tax base is declining year on year. The answer cannot be to increase taxes on whatever businesses are left. Telecoms is often one that's chosen for some special taxes, but that's taxing the investment that you need. So I think emerging economies really need to address this question of digital taxes, and this is a good example of where emerging economies' interests are not aligned with those of the richer countries. I mean, the OECD process, I would suggest, is not going to deliver digital taxation for the developing world. It's going to deliver more tax for the OECD countries, all right, and they'll do fine, thank you very much. And they are opposing solutions by the rest of the world. But I think it's very important for emerging economies to really prioritise what they need. And the final point is, as I said, the Broadband Commission said if digital taxes are introduced, some portion of that should go towards connectivity. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Please, sir.
Hasselbachus from the Ministry of Digital Transformation, Trinidad and Tobago. Just to be clear, I used to work for a network service provider, so I was a CTO there, so I'm speaking this from a slightly technical perspective.
We cannot hear you very well. If you can be closer to the...
Can you hear me now? Yes.
Yeah.
From the 5G perspective, is it that they've completely merged the fixed wireless access and the mobile elements of it? And when we say 5G, we say the same thing. To my memory, they were very different. Use cases were different, and there were different levels of maturity. And the impact to where they were going to be was going to be different as well. So when you say 5G and where it's going, is there a separation, and how does that impact in terms of its funding and where it's going to go from that? And I'm glad I have David from a service provider perspective and John, you there from that. The second question stems from something I heard yesterday and was somewhat repeated about unsafe networks. And I want to understand what that means, particularly in terms of 5G, both from the GSMA standpoint and from the point of a service provider. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Do you want me to
Yeah, I didn't hear the
John,
first one.
David, both.
So I wasn't here earlier for the discussion, but just on, I agree with you that perhaps there may be different approaches for fixed wireless access and different uses of 5G, and that's a more specific solution. In the Caribbean, obviously, we have some large urban settlements where I think, one could argue perhaps 5G is more commercially viable. But I think a large-scale rollout of 5G at present looks extremely unlikely from inside the industry. There's just no use cases at all that I've seen. So I would be very surprised if it's used, and certainly on mobile network, but even on fixed wireless access. While it would seem the obvious starting point, I think we're some way away from that.
John, something to add?
Just quickly, I mean, obviously, fixed wireless access has been one of the, first movers in 5G. I think one of the things we're quite focused on at the moment is this whole notion that this isn't just an evolution to faster, better mobile broadband, which of course it is, but I think increasingly the use cases around industrial facilities type uses. For example, you could imagine perhaps, and you're closer to this than I am, so I can't say, but ports and managing international shipping and manufacturing facilities. Of course, that will vary country to country based on their own economic models. But I think it's still. I think the use cases are still in their infancy. But I think that one of the things we need to remind ourselves is that we are. When we first talked 3G, 4G, nobody could have imagined what it would actually turn out doing and how it would move to this platform economy and how we would be where we are today with these devices. It was really just going to be faster, better mobile broadband at the time. And I think what we can't quite envision the full potential of what 5G will be, but we know there's a huge number of use cases that are starting to emerge. We'll see a lot of them in Barcelona next week, but it's still early days. It says globally, we're only looking at 12% of connections are 5G. So realistically, it is still on the horizon. And I think, as we spoke before, I think we need to be mindful that it will take off in some places first. And then the question is whether others can leverage the innovations and the economies of scale that come from the deployment elsewhere.
Thank you. The gentleman in the middle, I think, has, yeah.
Thank you very much. I had a question for John, but he answered it. So let me summarize. For instance, in developing countries like Pakistan, we have less than 3% 5G handset penetration. So that's one indicator of the ecosystem readiness. Then, of course, it was very hard for the operators to justify the business case for 5G. And it is very hard for the government to accept the fact that, to offer 5G spectrum for very, very rationalized pricing. The other thing is, in developing countries, we have a lot of available 4G spectrum in place, because 5G is only mature in 3500 megahertz right now. So in countries where they have 700 megahertz or 2300 megahertz or 2600 megahertz available, it might be the right strategy, as you said, to focus on better 4G for all rather than 5G for few, right? So this was my comment. I have a question for David, and please excuse me for putting up a simplistic question. We experience that when we access the highway or a motorway or an autobahn, depending wherever you are, an individual car is charged separately, and a commercial vehicle, for instance, a transport bus, is charged separately, because an individual user is using it for himself only, while a commercial user is using the highway for commercial purposes. So why don't, considering the fact that these, some of the very large digital players are using the highways built by the operators for their own commercial purposes, why don't the operators charge them separately? Why is there no consensus among the operators to charge them accordingly? And we remain business sustainable, feasible for the operators and for the digital players. Thank you. I hope my question is clear, David.
Yeah. No, I understand. Well, the simple answer is we tried that and they wouldn't pay. And we did try that some years ago. I think what was interesting is there was a new legislation in parts of the Caribbean introduced, or it's in the course of being introduced, but there was a lot of discussion about whether, and these discussions have been going on for a number of years, but at the time, it was before the United States changed its policy, there was net neutrality was what everyone was talking about, if you go back 6 or 7 years ago. And what was very interesting was the policymakers in the Caribbean said to us, what's important for us is consumers. We absolutely support you getting paid by the commercial users of your internet networks. So if you can do it and they pay you, no problem. And on net neutrality, and I think net neutrality is and that is the blocker, in particular in Europe. But again, it's one of these red herrings. Nothing is going to change for consumers. This was solved very easily in the Caribbean because instead of legislation, the industry, the telecoms industry, came together and said, no problem. What we'll do is we'll agree a voluntary code that we won't block or throttle traffic, and there's no need for legislation, and it's worked very well. The problem is, of course, now you've no leverage, and this is why it's a regulatory failure as such. In that case, it's voluntary form of co-regulation, if you will. In Europe, there is net neutrality legislation. In the United States, there isn't. They withdrew it. But you've no bargaining power whatsoever. So this is why, as I said, it's a regulatory failure. You need some other regulatory instrument to oblige people to engage, because if your only remedy is we won't give you our service unless you agree something commercially with us, and we can't say that, then we've no leverage whatsoever. So that's the key issue. But I would say about net neutrality, and I think it's a really interesting discussion because it's going to open again this year, is the whole reason big tech pushed so hard on net neutrality 10 years ago was because they saw this coming. And if you look at what happened at the time, and you look at how some of the platforms had these millions and millions of emails sent to the FCC and all that. I mean, if that happened today, it would be a scandal. It would be a disinformation campaign, is what we'd call it. So if you think back at the background of how the sort of pressure that was put to bear to introduce these laws. Now, the United States withdrew it after 2 years, and I think the European Union is going to look at its policies again, and the Caribbean, as I said, and other emerging regions thought it wasn't necessary. But the end question is, will consumer experience be any way different if the dominant platforms have to pay something? No, it won't.
Can I just quickly give a perspective from Europe at this point, because you referenced the EU. I do want to say that within Europe, I think, as you noted in your presentation earlier, obviously there are different market circumstances in different parts of the world. And when we're looking at this challenge of investment, I think you probably do have different regional variations in how you approach it. But in Europe right now, there's very much an aligned position among all of the European operators that something needs to be done with this market power imbalance. You have some of the biggest companies in the world who have absolutely no incentive to come to the table, and they worry if they do come to the table, that will happen globally, which is exactly what we should all be looking at, I suppose. Because the question is, what they will argue, I think, is that the consumer is paying for broadband access, they want to access us, and so that's what's happening. But the reality is they keep on driving more and more value to themselves by generating more and more traffic. It's gone up fourfold just in the past few years, and it's going to go up four morefold in the next few years. And every bit of that requires investment in networks. And the challenge is, who should pay for that? We already know there's investment challenges in the markets. So in the European case, for example, should the burden entirely fall on European consumers and European businesses, or should those making the most money over the networks contribute something? And I think that is the debate. There isn't the answer yet. I think we at the European operators community believe that the threshold should be 5% of average traffic. Therefore, you're only getting the biggest players. You're not stopping small innovators working out of their garage. But that's, I think, the big question that will be upon us this year. I think it will be a big topic next week in Barcelona.
Absolutely.
And we'll see how it evolves. It's going to be a big fight, I think.
For all the things we said today, I think that was the sure thing. Well, yes. Let's go at the back, and then you, sir. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Mulembo Munaku. I'm coming from United Republic of Tanzania, from the ministry responsible with ICT. Now, from the presentation from majority of the ministers, it's such that the biggest challenge is finances in terms of expansion of infrastructure and networks. Now, my question goes to David. You have presented different innovative financing models, basically to cater, for broadband, bridging the broadband connectivity gaps. Now, I'm assuming that probably these various models basically could work better or could best fit based on the nature of the nature of advancement of economic development of a given country. Now, in your opinion or in your suggestion, which model would best fit in developing countries? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. I think it's quite important that there's a degree of commercial flexibility left open. And this is why certainly our view is that a framework that obliges parties to engage but isn't prescriptive as to the outcome is the right way to start. I truly believe that the vast majority of companies that are subject to such an obligation will come to a commercial arrangement that's acceptable. Obviously, there'd have to be a degree of transparency and regulatory oversight to ensure fairness for all market players. So in the Caribbean, for example, there's the operators there are cooperating, I suppose, through the auspices of the Caribbean Telecommunications Union to discuss these matters with some of the big tech players. And, one of the key principles is non-discrimination. So different solutions may work for different platforms, but whatever happens, the outcome has to be fair to all of the networks in the region. So you can't play one operator off against another or favour one, But within that envelope, I think, it may suit some big tech companies, as I said, to develop a partnership. There's a really good example in Peru. It's called Internet por Todos, where some of the operators, and in that case it was Meta, came together to build out a 4G network in an unserved rural area. So that's one example of a partnership. Other companies might prefer to just build a project, and that's where that USF pay or play idea would be relevant. That if a company wants to come in and say, we want to build this part of a network, and that would be our contribution to this country, that would be fair. But certainly, there have to be some sort of backstop, and that would be the issue for regulators. So in the Australian case, what happened was the regulator is empowered to get, if there's no agreement or if someone doesn't engage, they get an arbitrator to make a final decision on what's fair. And there'd have to be some sort of guidance or some sort of framework to make that decision. Our view is that that a direct financial payment for data and how you price it and so on would have to be agreed is probably the way to do that, and that would seem to make the most sense. And then any player who doesn't engage in the process or is unreasonable could ultimately be subject to a regulatory solution, and they would know more or less what that is. But horses for courses, different solutions. I think there's a huge opportunity for developing countries because there's so much that we need to do, and some of these big tech companies are interested in solving these problems. They don't want to do it first. They don't want to do it unless the others are doing it. They don't want to unless they have to. So I think having the framework that obliges parties to come to the negotiating table is the key thing that we need to start with.
Thank you, David. I think we have time for 2 or 3 questions. What's the gentleman here, I think?
Hello, thank you. Firstly, just to thank the panel. My name is Francesca Lamarck. I am from the UK's Department of Science, Innovation and Technology. And I wanted to pick up on one thing that John mentioned earlier, which was the open and interoperable technologies and what they might do to improve the security and the resilience of 5G supply chains in future. I was hoping you could perhaps expand on that, on where you see the opportunities and what countries can do to help capitalise on those potential opportunities for the future.
No, absolutely. Thank you for the question. I think that the challenge we have today, is if you have, if you have 3G in a country and you're looking to port 4G, or 4G in a country, you have to use the exact same supplier. You have to build the stack with the same supplier that provided the underlying technology. So there's absolutely no flexibility to get equipment from. For example, you couldn't blend. The names mentioned today. You have Huawei, you have Ericsson. You couldn't put them in the same stack. So I think obviously that creates, some challenges in terms of your flexibility and your ability to reach out to different competitors, depending how you have already deployed. So one of the things that I think is already happening commercially, because again, I think we need to be careful because obviously we want to make sure the robust health of our existing suppliers, Ericsson and others. But I think that making sure that there is the ability to put different pieces of equipment together in a network and therefore choose from different suppliers. It also allows for companies to come in at different parts of the stack. So you wouldn't necessarily have to have somebody ramped up to the scale of some of the largest equipment manufacturers in the world. So we were looking at this question. We call it Open RAN. But it's definitely, there's a lot of technical aspects. I would be happy to actually facilitate some additional discussions. We have a lot of teams focusing on this. I think commercially it is starting to happen. I think we have a long way to go. And I think that one of the most important things you mentioned and what you said, of course, was security. It is very important we maintain the integrity and security of the networks. And that is an important element as you start to bring in different suppliers into the same stack. I would love to see you after this, and maybe we can facilitate some further dialogue.
Thank you, John. The gentleman here in the front. Here. The microphone here, please.
Oh, thank you very much. And my question is to Isabelle. And just before I ask it, I might have shot myself in the foot just earlier. There was a gentleman from OneWeb who had occupied my seat just, and then I didn't know where else to go, but I politely asked him for the seat. And I've been looking for him, and I hope I'll get to see him. But the question is this, really. I just want to paint a picture because I come from Botswana. It's a very sparsely populated country, a huge landmass. And I'm basically tasked with trying to make sure that we connect every citizen in their country. But we have a very unique and very acute problem. We've got productive areas, tourism areas, farms, 6 by 6 kilometer, a family in there, that sort of thing. And, the only solution that we've got in those very remote areas has been to use satellite and VSAT, which has been very costly. And I just want to ask about these low Earth orbit satellites, because increasingly that seems to be the solution that might be the best and most viable for us. And it's just a question about when, what sort of price factors that we're seeing in terms of reductions, if we are, and how do we go about partnering with these providers. And really, that's my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Isabelle.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, because I thought, I had been forgotten in the corner here. So no, thank you so much for the question. I think that there is a lot of attention at the moment that is brought onto the LEOs. I hope my colleagues of OneWeb or Telesat who are in partner, they're like the new kids on the block. So there is a lot of excitement, and I think that is extremely positive, because with anything new comes, with any innovation comes also increased competition, and comes, a sort of a new incentive, if you want, to bring new solutions to diverse areas, of the world. So what we are seeing is that, of course, as you know, and it's not just OneWeb, we see a few of these LEOs operators that are launching already, low orbit satellites. The latency is going to be better, on the satellites, the capacity as well. But it's not just about the LEOs. I think we really need to look at what is happening overall in our sector in terms of innovation. And there are, GEO satellites that are there as well. We see a high put through, that satellite. So we see a lot of innovation that is going to happen, that is happening, and that is going to increase. And I think you say, what can we do to be at the table with them? Well, I think, first of all, come to us as the GSOA, because we'll be very happy to discuss with you in Botswana and look at solutions, that we can bring to your country. You mentioned that there are very specific areas. As we know, there is not one silver bullet. I always get it wrong. One silver bullet for all, or something like that. But it's really looking at different solutions that are going to be, the most adequate to reach, the areas that you need to reach. You mentioned there are regions that are highly tourism. We are high tourism. There are others that are very low density. So that would be a very good start, I guess, for us to sit at the table with you and see what are the requirements, what are the needs on the country, and bring you, the players we have around the table at GSOA to see what would be the best opportunities for you. But it's really, one thing I want to mention, because there was a lot of question to costs about, for David and for John. And I really want to reiterate that moving forward, even in particular as we look at 5G, no industry, every government in this room is undergoing a recession. Every industry is going through really hardship. John mentioned, revenues are falling, ARPU. So we all need to look at solutions that are really going to make us all work together to find the most cost-effective solutions to bring, to Botswana and other countries where circumstances are different as well. So again, there is not just one solution, but like the LEOs are part of the solution, but many others as well that we can work together to bring the best solution to your countries. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I owe this last question here in the front, and I think we have to stop here.
Thank you so much. I'm Usman Aliu from Nigeria, the regulatory body. So I will have a question for Isabelle and John. But starting with what we have in Nigeria at the moment, we have rolled out 5G recently because we believe the world is going into a data-centric period, that we really need to provide this high throughput to people and then allow the innovations to kick off. We have the geo satellites already. We've also licensed Starlinks. They have already gone live also in the country. So from that perspective, it now means that we have total coverage. If you look at maybe the high throughput satellites and also some of the terrestrial services that we have. So, but the challenge still remains the affordability of devices and terminals in case of the satellite. So what can we really do to bring down the cost of these devices to make them affordable? Because for the terrestrial operators, it's still the smartphone devices. So the same phone, my same phone that can do 4G can also do 5G now. But how is it affordable to the people over there? So we have the satellites covering the entire country with high throughput, low latency. But what is the cost of the terminals that these people can still get? Is it possible for us to probably look inwards, for instance, to Africa, to look at manufacturing some of these terminals and then these smartphone devices in Africa, try to scout around the mineral resources that we have, that make up these components, to see if they can be sourced from Africa with the lead from GSOA, with the lead from GSMA, to see if some of these devices can now be manufactured there with the cost of labor low in the developing countries of Africa, to see if that could really drive down the affordability. And then I believe our problems will really be solved, because you have that, broadband all available, but people are not able to afford those devices to use them easily. So that's the question to the...
So is that okay? So we can...
Yeah.
Please, let's be as short as possible, because we are running a bit...
Very quickly, and I'll pass on to John. But, I before I joined the GSOA, before my time at the World Economic Forum, I was at the GSMA, actually. And that's an issue we looked at the time, and John will remember, with 3G handsets as well. So the cost of handsets, of terminals, has always been something that we had to look at. And now I guess we led, when I was at the forum, the Edison Alliance for digital inclusion. And I know that one of the areas that we're looking at when we talk about, mobile handsets was also the affordability of the normal mobile handsets that you have, the 3G or 4G handset. So satellite is no different. I think, there is an effort there that needs to be done. Like, we really need to look at those in particular, as I was mentioning, that we are seeing also an uptake of satellite direct-to-handset services. And that is really something that I guess with operators, but with vendors as well, we need to look at, what are the solutions as we roll ahead and as we plan to have increased direct access to handset. Whether we can work with, the mobile operators or not, I mean, sort of a world where we have the one handset that is satellite. I think there are, we're looking into that as well. It's been looking into. So, but from our side, I think that you are right. There is a way to go there and something to be explored.
Just quickly, I mean, I think you've come back to exactly the key question here for us, which is how to bridge the digital divide. And the biggest barrier, one of the biggest barriers, is handset affordability. We have worked on this a long time. We've even tried to come up with specs that would make an interesting device that would be at a lower price point. We worked quite a lot, for example, with Reliance Jio in India, because we thought with the scale of the market, it's very difficult. We must not give up on it. We will be holding meetings in Barcelona on the Ministerial program on exactly this topic. In the meantime, though, I would encourage us to be creative on how we look at financing those devices. And I would point to the example of the initiative in Rwanda between MTN and the Bank of Kigali as one starting point. I think there's innovative ways to get more people access. We still need to drive down the overall cost of the devices, though. And that we don't have a solution for yet. But hopefully if you're in Barcelona, you can help us have that discussion further. So,
thank you, John.
Chair, could I just add one remark, and that is, services over telecoms networks used to subsidize handsets. That's the model that used to exist. There's no reason why we can't go back to that. Just the services are provided by over-the-top providers now. But why shouldn't they subsidise handsets. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I guess there are quite a few of you that didn't have the chance to ask your question. Definitely, it's a very big subject. It cannot be solved today, but I guess what it matters is to make you think. And of course, the important thing is either you're talking about spectrum, about policies, about digital taxes, about convergence in networks. We always need to keep in mind affordability and the affordability of devices. Well, I would like to thank the speakers and, of course, the honorable ministers and regulator. Can I ask you to come here forward for a picture if you can, please? Thank you very much.